9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is the DSR Podcast. Hello and welcome to Deep State Radio. I'm David Rothkopf, and I am joined by our loyal, true guiding lights, Rosa Brooks of Georgetown University Law Center. How are you doing, Rosa?
I'm good, David.
Excellent. That's terrific. And Edward Luce of the Financial Times. How are you doing, Ed?
Very well, thank you, David.
Are you recovering from your book launch? Are you do you feel better? Are you still feel inclined to sign any book that's put in front of you, whether you wrote it or not?
Yeah, in fact, I break into bookstores at night and I just randomly ensure those signed books cannot be returned to the warehouse.
You know, Kissinger used to say that he had signed so many books that the ones with his signature were worth less, actually.
Yeah. It's but I did have a friend who didn't sell too many books. Obviously, it's not me.
Of course,
who did he went to bookstores and he would ask for his book and then he'd sign them all just purely because he knew they then couldn't send them back. It's quite labor intensive.
It's very, very clever. All right. Well, look, I was thinking about the kind of stuff we normally talk about here, which tends to be foreign policy, national security, and so forth. In light of several comments that we've seen from our president and those close to him recently, the one that particularly sort of struck me, kind of stuck in my craw a little bit, was him going, "Well, I don't know, I'm not that interested in Ukraine anymore. I'm kind of done with it." And he seems to have sent a similar message with Gaza. Well, if they're not going to solve this, then I'm not into it. And, his general message with Europe is, I'm kind of not that into Europe. And, and so on. And it seems to me that at the heart of U.S. foreign policy, lies a deep ambivalence about foreign policy. Diffidence, disengagement, or the president's own narcissism is driving it. And I was just wondering if, after 4 months of Trump being president, you feel comfortable in any way characterizing the foreign policy of the Trump administration. And I'll begin with you, Rosa.
That implies that there is a foreign policy, as opposed to, I think you characterized it exactly right, a kind of narcissism as policy. Apparently, the Pentagon has incidentally taken possession of that jet that the Qatar was offering to President Trump to be the new Air Force One. So that is now our foreign policy. Our foreign policy is entertain me, bribe me, and flatter me. And maybe I'll be nice to you for 10 minutes or so until I get bored, in which case you're going to need to bribe me, entertain me, and flatter me a little bit more. And if you fail to do those things, bye-bye, I'm bored. The only other thing I would say, going back to, honestly, it might be best at this point for the entire rest of the world for Trump to completely lose interest in it, because the second his attention focuses on another country, he comes up with some idea that is somewhere between terrible and obscene and unconscionable. So frankly, the less he thinks about the rest of the world, the better off the rest of the world might be at this point.
That makes a lot of sense, particularly because moments before we began to record this, I was listening to the meeting between the President of the United States and the President of South Africa, which Trump, by the way, referred to as Africa as a country, in which Trump, kind of had a hit and run set up where he had a screen and he was, wanted to show pictures of what he alleges is white genocide in South Africa, which isn't, of course. And this is some line of baloney that Elon Musk has fed to him. But it does seem, Ed, kind of, I know there's all these Mad King sort of themes around, but it really does seem kind of like, the foreign policy is built around the 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 whims and service of just this one guy. It really, it's like the madness of King George, or one of those movies, where it's like, it's this kooky guy, and he'll say whatever he says, and whatever amuses him, and bring him a gift, he'll be happy. And I don't know. I'm finding it all kind of kooky, and I'm just wondering what your thought is.
Yeah, I mean, King George was, I mean, they did invoke an informal version of the 25th Amendment with King George. I mean, he was basically sort of locked away from public view till he recovered from Tourette's or whatever it was that was ailing him. That option is never going to be exercised with Trump. And therefore, we'd better get used to this sort of Roman emperor crooking his little finger and plucking from a bunch of grapes on his bed in his palace, surrounded by people sort of waving elephant grass at him to keep him cool. I mean, this is the kind of scene we're now used to, and we're going to have to we're just going to have to sort of grin and bear it, because that is America's foreign policy. Marco Rubio has these positions because he is a yes man, not a strategist. There is no upside to disagreeing with Trump. You'll find, like Mike Waltz, that you're out, and therefore we just get a magnification of this imperial crooked finger as foreign policy, and his narcissism and his boredom threshold are sort of closely related. If somehow the Russia-Ukraine quotation marks peace process, which hasn't actually begun, but which Trump has now abandoned, if somehow that could yield him a promise of $3 trillion investments over a decade, all entirely fictional, plus, a jumbo jet thrown in, he might get interested in Russia, Ukraine. He was briefly interested in the potential for critical mineral deals there, and they even signed a deal. Zelensky sort of learned how to do the Trump whispering. But, none of them are going to come to fruition while Trump's president. There's no real way of monetizing them now.
I wonder why.
And what does Russia have to do?
Airplane. They should give him an airplane, for God's sake. A better airplane.
They should give him a swarm of drones. They are now the world's leading killer drone makers, and arguably the most high-tech defense industry in the world. They're just innovating like nobody's business in Ukraine. But I guess he could get a piece of that, but he's not going to get sufficiently interested to fund Ukraine's sort of renewed military supplies, and so this isn't just a sort of great reality TV show. This is a tragedy, slow motion tragedy in the making. Gaza, of course, is a fast motion tragedy in the making. And if ever a US president should be interested, it would be now. I mean, every single one of America's allies have finally found a spine on this issue and are speaking out. But there's no commercial benefit for Trump. There's no sort of easy deal to be won, and so nothing's going to happen. It just doesn't interest him.
Yeah, apparently 18 months of genocide is what it takes for most of our allies to wake up to this kind of thing. The United States, of course, does not wake up to it. But Rosa, as Ed says, as you had said, it's almost as if we could zero in a little more. It's, I don't know, narcissist. It's almost Trump's id that is, it's just like he wants to be stimulated, or it's like, what does he think will make good TV? And he's producing this reality show about himself, and it's kind of like 21st century Caligula or Nero. It's even more than George III. It's just a place we've never been. But let me take it beyond that. Okay, go ahead.
Well, this gives me an idea. I mean, no, absolutely right. It's like having American policy being run by an angry, sleep-deprived toddler. But And one of the things that is interesting is the degree to which part of the reason a lot of people who voted for Trump voted for him is because they mistook the Trump of The Apprentice for the real thing, right? They thought, oh, he seems decisive, he's a good businessman, he's thoughtful, he makes smart decisions, and that sounds like what I want in a president. And what they don't understand is that he had a producer, he had a director, he had people who were scripting him, he had people who were controlling that quote unquote reality show, so that it wasn't actually the reality of Donald Trump's personality. It was a carefully curated and managed version of Donald Trump, guiding him for the ratings to make much better decisions than he would have made on his own. So perhaps, maybe this is the insight. Maybe forget the 25th Amendment. Somebody needs to go to Trump and say, Mr. President, your ratings are down. You can see it at the polls being the ratings. We can bring your ratings back up again, but let's bring back a really ace production team that can help you get better ratings. And then, under the pretense of helping, I think your framing of this is Trump's new national reality show, and unfortunately we're all living in it. Maybe under the pretext of getting a better ratings, somebody could actually persuade him to stop being such a raving lunatic and such an asshole, and to actually act a little teensy weensy bit more like a president. That would be really nice. I wonder if there's him. What do you think? Can we get traction for this? Where are the producers when we need them?
It seems to be the way it's being run. When something looks like it's going to get bad rating, a tariff, thing looks unpopular, he just backs away from it. I was going to end the war in Ukraine. Oh, I can't end the war in Ukraine. Okay, let's just move to a different storyline here. And yes, he could use Andy Cohen or one of these guys to come in and do the Real Housewives.
Smooth it out a little here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a good thing. But and the thing to me that is striking is that for a lot of the world, they don't see the absurdity. Some of the world does, Europe does, but a lot of people thought that the Middle East trip was a big success. And I was with an ambassador from a country not in the Middle East, who's been an ambassador in many places. And he said the strangest thing to me. He said, Marco Rubio is a very strong man. It was like, Marco Rubio, I think he's got some good people. The J.D. Vance also is very, very good. And, I wanted to be polite to the guy, so I didn't guffaw. But there are people around the world who are just kind of buying into the show.
So diplomats have to do this. And even in private conversations with, known and well-grounded skeptics like you, I guess it sort of becomes muscle memory. That's the role of the diplomat. But, and I do concede to some degree, because I've had conversations with diplomats who've had meetings with Trump and with Vance and with Rubio, that in private, Vance, stops his performative stuff. And, the guy isn't stupid. He's profoundly cynical and I think malevolent, in fact, in his impact on global diplomacy. But he's not stupid, and he realizes when the Klieg lights are off, then, he can sort of have perfectly reasonable conversations. So, I guess diplomats are sort of paid to think and act like that. And we just have to sort of deeply discount everything they say. But, the Trump show with Cyril Ramaphosa today won't get nearly as much attention as the one with Zelensky, or indeed with Bukele, the El Salvadorian strongman. But it is an obscene thing that the world does see. They do notice that America has cut off refugees from everywhere else, aid to victims of disasters worldwide, that Trump, has contempt basically for non-white countries, and that the one group he's chosen, selected, is Afrikaners, Boers, most of whom are living the life of Riley in South Africa. They are a very privileged, well-protected minority. Farmers, of course, are vulnerable in that country, black farmers included. There is a crime rate everywhere. But the way Trump humiliated and ambushed Ramaphosa, that's on the global stage. and people do notice this. And, diplomats, I guess I just trained, not South Africa's ambassador, by the way, who was expelled. But diplomats, I guess, are just trained to see and hear no evil. It's a very rare diplomat who's outspoken when you've got a volcanic force like Trump as president. It's depressing, but their job is to try and see the bright side, even if there isn't one.
Yeah, but one of the things that they do to manipulate Trump is to play to his ego. And to, even Ramaphosa sat there today. It was like, well, where is this? Well, I haven't seen this before. Please send this to me. And the media around it was like, well, there's some issues with sourcing. And I was like, but this is complete racist bullshit. It's none of it's true. But they placate it. And even some of the diplomats who are super cynical feel that it's the proper thing to do is to placate him. And so, Rosa, the question becomes, they're not making life easier for us or for them, because the more he's placated, the more he continues on with the show. And isn't the real response? The Chinese placate him, but they also told him to fuck off. Isn't the real response to stand up to a guy like this? Maybe I'm just wishing for that. But what do you think, Rosa?
Stand up for him or ignore him. Stand up to him or ignore him. The obsequiousness doesn't get people anywhere. And it is kind of stunning to me that there are still people, whether they're journalists, world leaders, members of Congress, et cetera, who haven't grasped that it doesn't matter. You can be obsequious and he'll like you for 5 minutes, but that doesn't mean he's going to like you 10 minutes after that. You will have sacrificed your integrity, you will have humiliated yourself, and it will be for nothing. Right? Maybe I can see, if I could bring peace to Gaza, would I humiliate myself for 5 minutes if being obsequious to Trump meant that we would somehow get some kind of better solution in Gaza? Yeah, I would. Right. And I'm sure there are lots of people who follow that reasoning. And I don't think that's crazy. Right. That if you could, at the sacrifice of your little bit of obsequiousness and embarrassing yourself, you could bring peace and harmony to hundreds of thousands of people and end atrocities. Would you do it? Sure. But it doesn't do it. And it is just mind blowing to me that so many people have not yet grasped that you will sacrifice your integrity, you will humiliate yourself for nothing. In fact, worse than nothing, because the more you give, the more they will, they will demand. This is the bully saying, give me your lunch money. And it's not going to be just this once. It's going to be every single day. And then it's going to be not just your lunch money. It's going to be everything else you've got. We absolutely, more diplomats, world leaders, business leaders, members of Congress need to figure this out. And they need to either say there's just no point in engaging with Trump. It doesn't matter. Why bother? I don't need to go to the White House. It's not going to get me anything. Or they need to go and speak the truth and accept the fact that he's going to have a little temper tantrum, but that's not going to be any worse than what he will do if they suck up to him.
Yeah, but Ed, let me play devil's advocate here for a second and frame it slightly differently. Most of the big problems of U.S. foreign policy over the course of my lifetime, stretching back to the War of Jenkins' ear, has been caused by, the problems have been caused by the U.S. getting involved where it shouldn't have gotten involved. For the U.S. thinking that it played this role as arbiter of global problems and meddler in affairs everywhere. And frankly, that hasn't turned out so well. So isn't there a potential advantage to having a president like Trump who really doesn't care about anything but himself?
I'm not normally stumped for words. I have considered some relatively well laid out arguments by other people.
Other than me, you mean?
Yeah, well, obviously, yes.
Yeah.
No. You didn't lay out the argument. You asked
Yeah,
the provocative question.
yeah.
But I mean, you did. What you said was by omission. Omission being wars of choice and sort of missions and zealotry that with America at its most sort of overreaching, that's not Trump. And I think, in terms of the impact of Trump last week, if you subtract the massive, the huge grifting that went on in the Gulf with Trump and his children and Witkoff's kid and everyone else in that circle, then you could say, look, Trump has at least said what the past has not worked. America's stance in the Middle East has not worked. Let's try something else. And that is more conducive to a deal with Iran, i.e. not war with Iran, than, turning up as George W. Bush and saying what America, the faults you just outlined, has often got itself into. That could be a positive by omission. But I don't think that these deals that sort of substitute are going to be good deals, which are really sort of conscientiously and expertly negotiated and drafted and are therefore going to last a long time. I think these deals are just as short-term as Trump's memory, or indeed as Pyrrhic as the massive headline investment numbers that these Gulf rulers unveiled for Trump. There's just a lot of bullshit, which gets back to the reality TV show of this. I mean, there is actually one being mooted, and the DHS, Kirsty Noem is interested, called Americans. And this is where people compete sort of Love Island style or Big Brother style to become an American citizen. And the DHS is interested in this. They're not interested in monitoring domestic terrorism. They've shut all that down. So in keeping with your and Rosa's theory, this is reality TV, and reality TV, you've forgotten 2 minutes later what you watched 2 minutes ago, let alone the last episode, which is ancient history. So I don't even trust the sort of Trump by omission being good news. Although, as I say, I've seen some respectable people arguing that.
Yeah, I've thought about that reality show, and obviously they talk about winning citizenship, but the downside is obviously that if you lose, what happens? You get sent to CCOT, and I just have imagined that they call, and now here is Tom Homan, and then he comes on and he's wearing like
Trapdoor
leather.
beneath you opens.
Yeah, exactly. They drag you away. But Rose, I recall over the course of the many decades we've been having this conversation that you have said things. Well, you probably quoted the great architect Mies van der Rohe and said less is more. When it comes to foreign policy, less is more. And we've talked about the fact that the US is the only place in the world where when something happens, typically somebody in some office goes, what do we do about it? Whereas in most countries, the question is, should we do something about it, right? So,
Can we do something about it?
Or can we? But, Trump is, corrupt, and he's an idiot, and he doesn't care about the world, and he's allied with the wrong forces, and, he's going to make some terrible decisions. And there are some things like Ukraine where we ought to stand up and be counted. But, net, the number of mistakes we may make might go down with a president who just doesn't give a shit.
Well, that's the argument I was making earlier, right? That the rest of the world might be better off if Trump would just completely lose interest in foreign policy. But I think, it's obviously it's a false choice, right? If the choice is between Trump as he has been in his first 100 and however many days in office, and the U.S. vanishing from the global scene, the world might be better off to have the U.S. vanish from the global scene. But those shouldn't be our options. Our options ideally should be an engaged but non-aggressive U.S. that uses its leverage and uses its influence to broker peace agreements, to help bring others together, to help create venues and conversations to solve collective problems like climate change, epidemic diseases, et cetera, et cetera. That should be a possibility. It shouldn't be either we're bellicose running around invading everybody, or we are totally absent from the scene. The only other thing I would add to that is, of course, Trump hasn't been entirely ignoring the rest of the world. He remains interventionist in sort of random and demented ways, that threatening Canada, threatening Greenland, threatening Panama, threatening to turn Gaza into a giant beachside resort and so forth. He's not doing nothing. He's not being harmless. This is not a do no harm approach to foreign policy, which again, all kinds of debates that one could have about the potential benefits of a vastly less interventionist, less exceptionalist approach to foreign policy, one that really is premised on do no harm. And I don't think do no harm has been enough of a guiding principle for US foreign policy running through every recent presidential administration. I think we've probably been too interventionist, too arrogant, too prone to think that any intervention by the US is better than none, and often none is better than doing things badly, and we often do things badly. But I don't think that Trump is not a do no harm guy. He's doing a tremendous amount of harm across the globe as well as in the United States. So I would rather, if he completely lost interest and just shut up and never said another word about the rest of the world, and he himself and his entire administration just stayed home, they would certainly do less global harm.
That's such good advice. That's all I can say. That's good advice. Just shut up. You know, or, for the rest of us, just change the channel. This has been a great conversation, as it always is. And we, of course, will continue to follow this with attentiveness week in and week out, as we do in all of our podcasts. So if you like what you're hearing here or in any of the other podcasts that we do, go to the dsrnetwork.com, click on membership, and help support the efforts of the world's smallest but most earnestly well-intentioned media company. Until then, thank you, Rosa. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll see you soon.